Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Last Born in the Wilderness. If you want to learn more about this project, you can go to the website lastborninthewilderness.com. You'll find a link to that website down in the description, and everything I'm going to mention here in the introduction is going to be found either in the description or on the website, so go check it out. If you'd like to support this work, there's a few ways to do that. The first, of course, is just to subscribe to this podcast. I have this podcast on various platforms, various streaming platforms, so consider subscribing and then sharing the podcast from there. If there's anybody you know in your life that would benefit or would be interested in the subjects discussed in these podcast episodes, please share it. That'd be really helpful. And if you would like to keep up to date with podcast updates, there's of course social media, but if that's not your thing, you can subscribe to the newsletter. You can go down the description, you'll find a link that'll take you to that as well. Again, you'll find that on the website. And if you would like to support this work monetarily, if you really like what I am doing with this work, please consider supporting it through monetary means, if you, of course, are capable of doing so. You can do so through a one-time donation. You can go to paypal.me/lastbornpodcast, and there you can throw a few bucks my way. If you really like this episode or any other episode I've done in particular, consider it a bit like a tip jar. You can throw a few dollars my way through that link. And also, if you look down in the description, you'll see a link that says everything else, I believe is what it says. That'll take you to my Linktree page. It has everything you need to know. And there you can find a link to the PayPal, to the Patreon page, and to Venmo as well. If you want to throw some money my way through Venmo, that's another option for donations. But like I just mentioned, you can support this work through Patreon. So if you want to really sustain this work regularly, you really want to help with the production of this podcast on a regular basis, you can do so through patreon.com/lastborninthewilderness. And you can start donating for as little as $1 a month. And by doing that, you'll gain early access to these interviews before the official public release. And you'll find other extras on the Patreon page as well if you're a patron. Every episode ultimately I do, every interview I do will be made public, but I just like to give my patrons a little early access, and of course they get it without all this extra introductory stuff that I throw at the beginning of these episodes. So consider supporting this work for $1 a month and you'll gain access to that. And if you would like to drop me a line, so I've started this thing where you call a phone number, it takes you straight to a voicemail, you can leave up to a 3-minute message that I can throw at the beginning of these podcast episodes and I can respond to them as well. So if you want to call the phone number 208-918-2837, that is 208-918-2837. Call that phone number, leave me a message, I'll put it at the beginning of the episode and I'll respond to it. And also I would like to say, if you don't want it included in the podcast, that's totally fine as well. Just let me know. I really appreciate that. Anyway, without any further delay, here's the episode. In this episode, I speak with Dmitry Orlov. Dmitry is an American-Russian engineer and a writer on subjects relating to economic, political, ecological decline and collapse. In particular, he has examined the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he's used that model and other models of collapse to understand the current decline of the American empire. So he's very prolific in his writing. He writes 2 essays a week. One essay he publishes publicly on his blog, cluborlov.blogspot.com. He also publishes one exclusive weekly post for his patrons at his Patreon page, patreon.com/Orlov. I support Dmitry's work. I give him $1 a month, and I'm able to have access to all of his writings. I find tremendous value in his systems thinking, his ability to analyze and understand the American empire in particular, and in comparison to other massive geopolitical forces like Russia, China, other countries, and how they're playing with each other on the global scale. He's able to analyze these things and put a lot of the kind of propaganda and the narratives that are spun by U.S. media, and he puts it all in perspective. So he gives you a very thorough overview of what's currently taking place, globally speaking, regarding the United States. So I originally contacted Dmitry last year, almost exactly a year to the day that we recorded this interview, the second interview. And I contacted him originally because I was reading some of his analysis of what was going on between the Trump administration, the United States, and it launched several missiles into, over 100 missiles into Syria last year. People were very, very concerned, understandably, I would say, including myself. I was very, very concerned that this would lead to a global war. Because at the time, of course, Russia was in Syria and the United States was kind of stoking the flames of conflict. And it seemed to me like this was a pretty risky thing that the United States was doing. None of those fears really came to pass, as in none of those predictions that we had that we were afraid were going to manifest, those never really took place. They never really manifested at all. Not to say that there wasn't a reaction from Russia or a reaction from Syria, but what it really showed more than anything is how inept the United States military really is at actually, doing anything again in that region. The main response by Russia was just sort of to ignore the United States in many ways, to sort of just let them have their little fit. But, we've been seeing in the past year several developments in the United States and its hegemonic power grabs, right? We've been seeing, just as of the recording of this introduction, the United States attempted to take over Venezuela and more or less do that through an interim president, Guaido, I think is how his name is said. Just a day or so ago, there was an actual attempt to militarily take over Venezuela, which failed. It's like the United States is becoming increasingly more belligerent, but at the same time, it's failing on multiple fronts to actually follow through with its threats. Now, that isn't to say the United States isn't a powerful force in the world, that it isn't, threatening. Absolutely, it is. But what we're seeing as a trend is even among American allies, formal American allies, are kind of turning their back on the United States, whether it's through monetary support, right, like moving away from the US dollar. They're beginning to align themselves more and more with Russia and China and other world players. And many of these world powers are just biding their time. They're just kind of waiting for the United States to collapse in on itself because it's drowning in debt. But like I said, this is a continuation of a conversation that we started last year. So hence the name of this podcast is America Faded Volume 2. I see this as a continuation of an analysis into the decline of the American empire. We're seeing it both happening externally, and how the United States is approaching world affairs, global affairs, but we're also seeing it internally. Living here in the United States, it's really hard to ignore the fact that the United States is declining in more ways than one, that we're experiencing collapse on multiple fronts. So Dmitry highlights all of these trends in his work in this episode. So I think Dmitry's analysis, his overview of all of these trends is incredibly valuable, and I think we should really be reading his work. We live in truly absurd and strange times, and especially with the converging crises on this planet, you just sort of have to, as Michael Rupert says, pass the popcorn. This is a time of great strangeness, absurdity, which can be simultaneously hilarious and inducing despair. There's just so much to take in all the time, and so people like Dmitry are really valuable because he's able to kind of frame it in a way that we can comprehend and get our bearings again, right? So I just want to thank Dmitry for speaking with me again. I hope to continue this conversation with him into the future. Like I said, I really enjoy his writing a lot. You can, of course, read his weekly free essays at his blog, cluborlov.blogspot.com. You can also support his work and get access to his Patreon-exclusive essays, which he releases once a week at his Patreon page, patreon.com/Orlov. And also, there is an alternative to Patreon now. It's called Subscribestar. So you can also support Dmitry through Subscribestar. You can go to subscribestar.com/Orlov. So I'll put links to all that down below. You can follow him on social media, but I think the best place to go, of course, is his Patreon, Subscribestar, or his blog, Club Orlov, to keep up to date with his writings. And I would also say that he is an excellent author. He has numerous books that he's published on the subject of collapse. So I'll put links down to those as well in the description, so you can go find his work there as well. So thank you so much, Dmitry, for your insights, for your excellent writing, and your analysis into this very crazy time that we're in. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for having this conversation with me. Thank you all for listening to me up to this point. Here is my interview with Dmitry Orlov. Well, Dmitry, I first just want to say thank you for doing this. We spoke it's a little more than a year ago. We had after our first interview, first time speaking together, we had made an appointment to speak about a year from then. So it's a few days off, but we're speaking again, and I'm really happy to do another interview with you. I think the first interview we did, and I don't know if you remember, but I contacted you because right around this time, the Trump administration had made the decision to launch some missiles into Syria. And there was I don't know how many, over 100 missiles, I believe, were fired. And I think a good amount of them, I can't remember exactly, but quite a few of them were shot down. And Trump was very proud of the operation, but that's just Trump speaking as he does for anything he does. But what happened is I remember leading up to that, and when it happened, I was very concerned, and many other people were very concerned about this leading to some broader global war, some sort of World War III type scenario. We were all very concerned about that. But you had a very sober and very practical analysis of it. And when we talked, you revealed a lot of things to me. You really kind of exposed how this event first of all, didn't lead to anything. I think most people have forgotten about it at this point. It's not talked about. I haven't heard anything since then. Russia didn't respond. Syria really didn't respond to it. And it really was just an indication, as you pointed to in that interview, that the U.S. and its influence, particularly in Syria, is pretty minimal at this point.
Russia did respond.
They did respond
in a way, because it provided Syria with its S-300 system. So the air defense has improved quite a bit, and that had some significant effects. First of all, the United States is unlikely to try another attack like that again, because it would be just too embarrassing. Secondly, Israel has had very limited success with lobbing missiles into Syria of late. They've had some successes and some failures. And another thing that's happened is that the Israelis, which have the F-35 fighters, they're really, really afraid to use them in Syria at this point. In fact, they loiter over Lebanon and they shoot missiles from very far away. But they can't really rely on these jets, which they spent a lot of money on. So some things did change as a result of that.
Right. I imagine there was some, as you just laid out, there were obviously some changes, but I think what my main takeaway from that conversation with you was that the U.S. empire, as it were, the U.S.'s influence globally is fading to a great degree. And it's interesting having that conversation with you a year ago has really given me a new lens, I guess, to look at what's happening currently up to the present moment since our first conversation. And I know this is sorry.
Well, I'm glad. I'm happy that I was able to do that.
Yeah, because I think, speaking as an American, I'm here in the United States. I think everything is framed in a certain way. It doesn't matter what part of, I guess you would call, the political spectrum you're on. It's premised on kind of an American exceptionalism. It kind of permeates everything. And so we think that what's happening to the United States, while I'm sure it's unique, there's identifiable patterns that can be like you have done. I know that you've documented the various stages of collapse. And while they may not happen in a necessarily a linear fashion, there's identifiable patterns that can be observed. And I think it's been very informative for people that are wanting to look at it from that perspective to see what's currently happening. So this is maybe a big question, but since we spoke a year ago, what have been some major developments that you have seen in that process? I guess we could say the process of collapse or the waning of American global influence.
Well, I think the most important thing that's happened is that there's been a realization within the United States as to what's really going on. Some bright people in the United States actually looked up and noticed what is happening and have realized that their approach, the American approach to basically dominate and try to take away the ability of various countries around the world to exercise their sovereignty, to basically butt in and tell people what to do, has a competitor now, a very asymmetrical competitor, which is Russia, because the Russian brand is, quite different. What the Russians do is they allow countries to assert their sovereignty. Russia does not try to impose its will. It does not try to dominate. It does not try to create vassals. It doesn't even try to form alliances. It does have some allies, but there's a belief in Russia that Russia has two main allies, which is the Russian Navy and the Russian Army.
Wow.
That's the mindset. So it doesn't really try to have allies. It just enables countries to stand up to the United States. And that's just sweeping the globe at this point. Country after country is basically signing up because they've had it with trying to follow the advice of the United States. They've realized that most of this advice is to their own detriment, that the U.S. is ultimately selfish. Mm-hmm. and out to weaken everyone, and so they're not going to put up with it anymore. So there's a great deal of upheaval now in the think tanks in the United States because they realize what the problem is, but they do not have a solution.
Mm. Why wouldn't they have a solution? Do you sense that there's any possibility that the United States may try to change its approach and maybe model itself a little more after what Russia is doing? Is that even a possibility, or are people too stuck in an ideological rut, or are there other factors that are not being considered?
Well, no. What the United States does is basically let countries build themselves up a little bit, but then pull the rug out from under them financially and let all the savings drain into treasury debt and other debt instruments that the United States can produce at will. And that's how it perpetuates itself. The business plan of the United States is to confiscate the savings of peoples around the world. If it cannot do that, then it's bankrupt, it's finished. And so it doesn't really have a plan B. Plan B is go bankrupt, and nobody really wants that.
Okay. So is that the only, do you see that's going to happen inevitably, regardless of whether they can continue to coerce countries into playing that game? Or is this something that, I guess the feeling is that the collapse is sort of inevitable, but if the United States can continue to play its part, the part that it has been playing for however many decades or however long, that they'll continue to keep on kicking the ball or kicking the can down the street,
I don't think it's going to work that well because part of it is economic dominance, and that's waning. The United States is a smaller and smaller share of the global economy. The way the size of the U.S. economy is calculated is basically taking all of the mutual back scratching that goes on within the United States, all of basically the service economy within the United States is huge. Most of the products being sold are imported and foreign made. Domestically, the United States produces lots of incredibly overpriced services, especially in medicine and education, legal services, all kinds of business consulting, outrageously expensive banking with all kinds of fees, all of that stuff, right? These are all services where Americans provide services to other Americans, and then they claim that they've made something of value. what is that? What difference does that make to the rest of the world? It's just this giant black hole where nothing emerges from it. Something happens inside, but why should the rest of the world care? But in terms of actual productive activity that goes on in the United States, if you subtract all of this stupid internal overpriced service economy stuff, it's a relatively tiny economy, much smaller than China, probably smaller than Russia. So I think that eventually this is going to catch up with it, because the only way it can perpetuate the scheme is by taking on debt faster and faster, not just more and more debt, but it's taking on debt faster and faster. It's a runaway train to nowhere.
Okay.
So at some point, it's just going to crack. That's going to be a big event.
Right. Yeah. And by comparison, what does Russia say? And I know that I bring up Russia because you do write a great deal about Russia, and I think it's actually quite enlightening because, again, being situated in the United States, so much of how Russia is discussed is through the framing of it being like this evil empire that's going to usurp America's hegemonic control over other nations and whatnot. It's like this kind of looming specter that everyone's afraid is going to, there's still this discussion about its supposed alleged influence in the 2016 election. Just today, a redacted version of the Mueller report was just released, so we'll see what comes out of that. But this sort of obsession in American media about Russia being this boogeyman, but you always provide a pretty lucid analysis of what's actually happening in Russia and how Russia actually approaches the United States and treats the United States on the international stage. So compared to where the United States is, how would you say, what is Russia? What is its development? How is it proceeding into the future?
Well, so far this century, it's been an absolute stunner in terms of how well Russia has done and how well Russia continues to do. And everything that the United States has done has been very helpful to Russia, extremely helpful. For instance, Russia has rearmed. The armed forces of the Russian Federation now are, light years ahead of where they were at the turn of the century. And the way it did that was by basically pretending that nothing's going on, that everything is corrupt, that resources are being squandered and stolen. They tried very hard to paint that picture. So everybody in Washington just pretty much assumed that Russia was down for the count, that it wasn't going to be able to do anything militarily at all, that it's just no longer a threat, and that it can be crushed at will. And then they were just completely taken by surprise, so that the situation now is that the United States can be crushed at will. Not that Russia is interested, but basically Russia can deter the United States from doing anything in the world. The United States can't do the same for Russia. And so basically the tables have turned. In other ways that the United States has helped Russia immeasurably is by imposing economic sanctions, and the EU followed suit. And that has led to a wave of import replacement, which has been a fantastic benefit to Russian industry. Russia has very low unemployment, lots of new jobs being created all the time, new plants and factories being opened. It's building, instead of importing cars, it is building foreign brand cars. Mercedes, for instance, is being built in Russia now to supply the Russian market and also to export. And that's been the trend. Just overall, the trend is unmistakable. Russia is doing better and better. As one example, one specific data point that's important is Russia has reserves now, sovereign reserves, to cover every single ruble of debt, foreign debt that Russia has. So it's completely immune to any sort of external financial manipulation. And if you look at, ruble to dollar exchange rate, it just doesn't move at all. Oil prices go up and down, but the exchange rate stays the same. So it's been decoupled. Another thing that's happened is that right now, if Russia stopped exporting hydrocarbons, natural gas and crude oil, it would still generate a trade surplus. So it is no longer really dependent on hydrocarbon exports in order to sustain itself. The structure in place is such that the tariffs on hydrocarbon exports go into the treasury and finance a lot of social spending. But that's calculated on the basis of really low oil price. It's higher now than what's been budgeted for. So there's a gigantic windfall. So in terms of all of that, Russia is doing really quite well.
In comparison, when you talk about oil production, how is the United States doing with domestic oil production? I know there was a big fracking boom. I don't currently know where that's at. In comparison to that, as far as energy production, how is the United States in comparison to Russia?
Well, Russia has a gigantic patch of shale oil under Siberia, and it explored it a little bit and was able to produce some oil from it, but decided that it's not worth it. It's too difficult. The United States, as far as the United States, fracking is pretty much all that it has left. The whole country is very, very much picked over as far as hydrocarbons. And the thing about fracking is it never made any money overall. It's a money loser. It's been a financial swindle. Basically, it was a way to convert people's retirement savings into smoke. It's like into dirty air. There are a lot of problems with it right now, which is basically all the sweet spots have been drilled out pretty much. So the fracking companies are finding it more and more difficult to find promising places to drill. Depletion rates are going up. Well productivity is going down, even though they're drilling longer and longer laterals, which are horizontals that are drilled and then fracked to take advantage of the thin layer that shale oil exists in generally, just a few meters thick. So all of that is kind of going badly. They've been able to, quote unquote, optimize production by just getting rid of quality controls. So now they're having a lot of trouble selling fracked oil. A lot of importers, such as South Korea, are basically refusing to take delivery because the oil that they're being sold by the Americans are gumming up their refineries and costing them a lot of money in equipment repair. So they don't really want to buy fracked oil anymore. And overall, fracked oil is too light to make diesel or bunker fuel, which are in high demand. Previously, that was done by mixing in Venezuelan oil, but the United States has imposed sanctions on itself and no longer imports Venezuelan oil. Actually, it started importing Venezuelan oil again, but not as much as before. It started importing Russian oil instead of Venezuelan oil, which is hilarious. So it's this stupid thrashing around, but basically overall it's a waste of money. Fracking overall is kind of at a midpoint. I don't think there's going to be substantial growth in it. Financially, it's doing worse than ever, really. Product quality is abysmal. And they're having a lot of trouble attracting new investment, which means that there isn't going to be a very high drilling rate, which means that production will fall rather precipitously, probably later on this year. So that's the picture.
Okay. And you mentioned Venezuela, and I've covered it. I did an episode about Venezuela, but that was right when the, I guess, attempted coup or whatever we want to call it. I mean, obviously it failed, or at least temporarily.
What is your take on all of that? I mean, when I think of like when we talked about last year, when we talked about the Syrian airstrike or the strike on various sites in Syria by the United States, and how it kind of didn't go the way I guess the Americans probably wanted it to. And I think about other incidences that were kind of embarrassing. I look at this attempt by the United States to intervene more directly in Venezuela and instigate something like a coup. It seems like, I wouldn't say that it's backfired, but again, I don't know. What has been your take on that entire fiasco?
Well, if you look at the White House foreign policy team, which is basically Trump, Pompeo, and Bolton, right? It's like the Three Stooges. They're the most incompetent people imaginable. Like their brains are just not really functioning. So what they tried to do in Venezuela is beyond hilarious. They picked this guy that people have been calling Random Guaido because he really is just a random guy. It also turned out that he's a bit of a fascist, which they seem to like fascists, so that's okay.
Yeah.
They like Ukrainian fascists, they like Venezuelan fascists. Anyway, he and he has blood on his hands too. But most importantly, nobody in Venezuela knows him from Adam. He's just basically some homunculus produced in a test tube in Washington, and inserted into Venezuela in the hopes that just by declaring that he's president, he will become president. And it doesn't work like that. So basically they thought that saying that he's president is enough to make him president. Then they staged some non-events. They didn't go as planned. And now they're in a situation where they're basically trying little acts of sabotage. They're playing games with Venezuela's electric grid, which is of course vulnerable. But this is not going to go their way, I don't think. They really don't have much of a plan. And the other thing that happened is that Russia and China basically put their foot down and said, no, you're not going to claim Venezuela as your own. Forget it. It's just not going to happen. So my reading of that is it's not going to happen.
Okay. I guess if we're going to stay in the Latin American region, I might as well bring up Ecuador. I'm thinking about just last week, I think it was, Assange was forcefully removed. Julian Assange, the editor of WikiLeaks, was forcefully removed from the Ecuadorian Embassy. They revoked his asylum. The original president that granted Assange asylum, Rafael Correa, was very sympathetic to Assange and very sympathetic to his cause with WikiLeaks, gave him asylum, and then a new president came in power, Lenin Moreno, who obviously is not nearly as sympathetic, and to the point where he's willing to, I guess, apparently it's a breach of international law, I think, to revoke asylum. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's been my understanding, which is that this is kind of an unprecedented move on behalf of any embassy. And by the British police coming in, removing Assange, he's now in some prison, probably somewhere in London. And the United States is working to get Assange extradited. And simultaneously, while this was all happening, Ecuador was, I guess, in the beginning, the process of receiving a pretty large loan from the IMF. So I don't know how you could fit this into a broader geopolitical trend, but how do you see the United States and its sort of dealings with, say, Latin America, and how they've used Assange as sort of a tool in that process?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised that Ecuador, flip-flopped. It's basically a banana republic. It's part of the dollar zone. Ecuador's currency is the U.S. dollar. It's full up with retired gringos because they've been resettling there. Because it's like a nice cheap place. The climate is nice, etc. So it's basically a U.S. colony anyway. Sometimes it gets its way by insisting on democratic principles. Sometimes that doesn't work very well. Money runs out. They need some more IMF debt or something, and then suddenly they have to start doing what Washington tells them to do again. which is all that's happened. That's not unexpected at all. Now, the fact that Assange has spent so many years locked up in that embassy is, rather sad. And the fact that he's out of there and probably getting some exercise and some medical care is probably a good thing. This had to happen eventually. He wasn't going to spend the rest of his life in that room, I would hope.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like such a good plan, And now that something is happening, at least there's a chance that, that something might go right. Of course, something might go wrong too, but how wrong would that be? You have to realize who Assange is. He's sort of like a Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. He's a little bit like Jesus Christ, ready for the cross, for Golgotha. He's a martyr for the truth, isn't he?
Yeah.
He asked the Russians for political asylum, and the Russians basically said, "No, we don't want any martyrs. Not our thing. Not really interested." But that's what he is. He's a martyr. So here's his chance to be a martyr. It's what he wished for, isn't it? It's what he worked for. Unabashed. Doesn't matter where the chips fall. Just let the truth be known. Doesn't really care about politics. So, when he was basically leaking information about, nefarious activities in the Pentagon, of course, lots of people in the U.S. Really hated him for it. But then when he leaked information about nefarious goings on in the Democratic Party and in the Clinton campaign, suddenly Trump started saying, "I love WikiLeaks" over and over again from a podium during the campaign. Of course, now that he's been arrested, Trump flip-flopped and said that WikiLeaks is not his thing.
Yeah,
which is really funny. I love WikiLeaks, which is not my thing. That doesn't really add up, does it?
No.
But who knows what'll happen? The thing about British politics right now is that it's in such a state of flux and dysfunction that it's very hard to proceed what's going to happen next.
Okay.
And so we can just wait and see and watch this, but we should keep in mind that Assange is a martyr. That's what he picked for himself. Mm-hmm. If he gets what he picked, as his choice, that'll be basically the working out of his fate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember years ago when he was just starting to get on the scene. This is probably after the 2010 leak, which is what apparently this originally was a sealed indictment against Assange by the Department of Justice here in the United States. But the whole thing is related to the 2010 leak from Chelsea Manning, when Chelsea Manning, originally Bradley Manning, but when Chelsea was in the military, got that information, which led to the release of that collateral murder video, which showed, U.S. military war crimes and things like that. But that's what the indictment is about. But people, and I see it over and over again in the media, whether it's U.S. senators, U.S. individuals, politicians, they keep on saying this is what he gets for intervening in the 2016 election process. And it just baffles me how it's not even about that. They can't get him for that. So they're going to try to prove that he intervened, that he helped Chelsea Manning get access to these files, which they don't have proof of either. And so I guess to maybe frame this in a bigger sense, which is, we've been talking a bit about how the United States is kind of, whether hilariously or not, failing on multiple fronts internationally. But what I still see is a very belligerent and still quite powerful and influential nation. And I guess when I first contacted you a year ago, even with all the things that you had said during that interview, which again reframed and refreshed my perspective, on it. It still gives me a bit of pause when I see things like this, because while the trend is a decline, I still see the United States as being potentially very, very dangerous, instigating global conflicts, or being very, very belligerent towards certain nations, certain groups of people. And seeing what's happening with Assange seems to me to be an indication of what the United States is willing to do. It doesn't seem to have any pretense anymore of doing things like this, trying to request an individual like Assange, who isn't an American citizen, who should be protected under First Amendment rights if he were to be tried in the United States. But they don't, again, no one really seems to give a shit any longer. And in your framing and understanding of say, the decline of a nation state like the United States, where does that fit in there? I mean, it seems still very frightening, I guess, to see that a country like the United States is still willing and capable to get away with stuff like this. Yeah.
Well, look, I think it's Assange's fault. I think it's all Assange's fault. All his leaks basically prompted the U.S. to go from the stance of, oh, no, we're not war criminals, to don't you dare call us war criminals, to the final phase, which is, yeah, we're war criminals, whatever, get over it.
Yeah.
That's where we are today. And everybody in the world kind of looks at that and says, okay, you're war criminals, fine. We'll take that under advisement and behave accordingly. So whatever the U.S. now tries to do, it just gets pushed back from everybody. It gets no respect. It's like, have you noticed the president of Egypt was in the White House? What did he do there? Basically said no. Everything that was asked of him, he said, forget it. And then he went back to Egypt and kind of reaffirmed all of that. That he's not going to do anything that the U.S. has asked him to do.
Mm. Is that
in their face? It's become completely obvious that whatever the U.S. tries to get done in the world, everybody is just going to not even ignore them, but just do the opposite toward them.
Mm. Are there any other? You mentioned Egypt, but what other nations that would maybe be considered allies of the United States? What other nations are moving in that direction, where they're starting to say pretty explicitly no to the United States?
Well, Turkey decided to buy the S-400 system from Russia, and the Pentagon, went into shock over that, and basically said that, well, if Turkey does that, then we're not going to sell the F-35 boondoggle aircraft to Turkey. And Turkey said, fine, that's fine. We won't buy it. It's your loss. So that's how that went. The Trump administration tried to lean on India to stop buying Russian weapons, start buying American weapons, and were told no, in no uncertain terms. They tried to stop Nord Stream 2 from being built from Russia to Germany, and leaned on Germany very heavily about that. Germany pretty much said no. And so this keeps happening around the world. It's going to continue happening. I think the trend is to basically sideline the United States internationally.
Okay. You had an interview that you did with, I'm going to say this wrong, I think it's the UNS review, the Saker, I think I'm saying that correctly, the Saker interviews
yes.
with you. And it's a very good interview. You go really in depth into the history of the Ukraine. And I found it just utterly fascinating, because while explaining that, you then explain how the USSR and how it functioned was very different from how we typically understand empires to function. The United States is pretty deeply involved with Ukraine, but also the Ukraine also has a lot of really deep economic ties to Russia. It seems to me to be a very complicated tangle of things going on there. I don't want to step on that interview too much because I know you flesh it out really well, but I do want to ask you about it because I'm trying to think.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I don't even know what the first question I would ask is, but when people think of like nations, right? We think of the Ukraine. We're like, oh, that is a self-sufficient nation state. You can see its borders clearly defined on a map. There it is. But that totally decontextualizes what is actually going on. As you have framed it, the Ukraine was, of course, a part of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union collapsed, it tried to, I guess, figure its own identity out, which it hasn't been very successful in doing. If you could talk a bit about, the Ukraine, its relationship with Russia, and how the United States is trying to, say, influence not only Ukraine but maybe try to influence the region as well, with how it's approaching, how it's influencing Ukrainian politics.
Yes, well, basically, after the Soviet Union fell apart, the Ukraine lost its ability to mooch off Russia. Basically, the way the Soviet Union functioned was that Russia was feeding the periphery, the other 14 Soviet socialist republics, sort of like a poor, emaciated, prostrate sow, being suckled by 14 fat, greedy piglets. And the Ukraine was the fattest and the greediest piglet. And at the end, basically at the end of the Soviet period, the Ukraine was the richest part of the USSR, the most industrially developed. It had a lot of high-tech manufacturing, rocketry, aircraft, things like that, marine engines. A lot of important stuff was built there. And then it spent the next 30 years basically robbing itself because it didn't really have access to any other source of resources, but it was used to, free access to free stuff all the time. So it really is a shadow of its former self because it stripped its assets stripped itself. And in the process, it developed a really incredibly corrupt and violent oligarchy. And it was politically manipulated by the U.S. because the U.S. decided to make the Ukraine into a sort of anti-Russia politically. It also entertained dreams of putting in a huge NATO naval base in Crimea, which would have pretty much destroyed Russia's ability to either protect itself or project force along its southern tier. And Russia deftly thwarted that by taking Crimea back from the Ukraine. But basically, it did succeed in politically turning the Ukraine into this Russophobic anti-Russian bastion to the Ukraine's own detriment because the Ukraine still keeps the lights on and the trains running and things like that, and heat in the houses thanks to Russia. Without Russian support, it wouldn't be able to do that. In spite of being incredibly anti-Russian, and earlier, I think it was late last year or early this year, it signed a 5-year deal for nuclear fuel for its old nuclear reactors, which provide most of the electricity there. 5-year deal with Russia. So it's like, we hate you, but we really, really need your help. Thank you. That's the attitude. And then, of course, the Americans can dictate various things to the Ukrainians in terms of being anti-Russian, but they can't really exercise a lot of control because the control is really with the oligarchy there. And since the United States itself is basically controlled by a shadowy oligarchy, it can't really force the Ukraine to basically do as we say, not as we do, and get rid of the oligarchs, because the United States has no know-how in reining in the oligarchy. The only country that knows how to do that is Russia. So there's really very little that the U.S. can productively do in the Ukraine at this point. It does have the ability to keep making things worse, of course, but that isn't helpful to anyone. As far as creating an entity that will just start a war with Russia, which is what the Americans wanted all along, that's really not in the cards. Nor will Russia be provoked into invading or attacking the Ukraine. What they really want is the separatists in the East to pretty much win on their own terms, without much Russian support at all. Some volunteers, some weapons, that sort of thing. But the Ukrainians have to sort this out on their own. And the Americans aren't going to be very helpful, but there's very little that they can do.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight all the various, different ways that the United States has tried to exert dominance. And I'm sure it's still able to do that in many places. But as you have demonstrated, even with the Ukraine, it's not really working. I guess the long-term goal, I imagine, for the United States is to, again, maintain and expand its influence. And it seems that the opposite is really unfolding right now. And so I wanted to, I guess, go back to the United States, because I am here in the United States. I am concerned with the trajectory that this country is going in. Not because I'm necessarily patriotic or all too eager for the United States as an entity to continue, at least in the fashion that it has up to this point. But obviously, this will have a deep impact on my life, just like it would with my family and anybody I'm surrounded with. And I see things like for instance, the abrupt climate change. I see an increase of really devastating floods, like we've seen in the Midwest. I actually just today I released an interview on that. I see that the United States will be unable to cope with not just climate change and all the other things that come with that, which includes the impact on infrastructure and things like that. But I see, again, in the long term, that the United States is just not going to be able to cope with all of these various things that are currently happening. And in your analysis of collapse, where do you see the United States right now? What major trends are you paying attention to? And what should we as Americans be paying attention to? I know there's a lot of media spectacle around certain things, but if there were some key details that you would ask people to pay attention to, what would they be?
I think probably the most important thing to realize about the United States is that it's on drugs and mentally ill, or both, to a very, very large extent. I mean, it's to such an extent that it's incredibly noticeable in a lot of the major cities. If you go to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle, it's just in your face. The place is full up with crazy people on drugs. Now, there isn't really the mental capacity within the general population or within the elite to process this fact. They think that what's required is drug treatment. That's the enlightened thing. It's like, well, let's get them on drugs for the rest of their lives that will, compensate for the lack of heroin or something else in their system. But I think the problem is that the reality in the country is such that people don't like it, and the way to escape reality, the cheapest, most cost-effective way to escape American reality is to do drugs. That's why people do drugs. And the reason people are insane all over the place, they're either depressed or schizophrenic or or something else, delusional, or they go senile at an early age, increasingly, or children are increasingly autistic, is because it's a depressing, autistic environment. If you live in a suburban house and are driven around by your parents, and all you're exposed to is television and video games and a sterile world where there's really nothing real and nothing to look at, okay, the chances are you'll end up with some syndrome or other, and that's what's happening. And then as you grow up in schools that don't teach anything, or if they do teach something, it's really nonsense that shouldn't even be taught. Well, okay, then you're going to end up a person who will try to do as many drugs as possible just to escape that reality, even for a little while. It's really that's the obvious thing. Why are so many Americans in jail? Well, because the ones who aren't in jail are still in jail. The whole country is a jail. The whole country is basically an open-air concentration camp. If you consider how many stupid rules there are and how people are expected to behave, it's a jail.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the kind of, speaking personally, I've been struggling with doing what I love, which is what we're doing right now, interviewing people, researching them, releasing episodes, trying to do what I can, and balancing that with everything else in my life, which includes making money, basically, going to a job and all of that. And being a part of the market, or the job marketplace, whatever I want to call it, is incredibly degrading, I think, for most people, including myself. It feels overwhelming. So when you talk about the drug thing, I think I don't necessarily think it's always because or it's always that people are looking for illegal drugs necessarily. They're looking for something to numb them or to help them cope with the reality that this nation has created for them, right? You're born into a society, and people don't always necessarily have the ability to understand why this sucks so bad. Like, why does it suck so bad to live in this time? We should be, and as we're told over and over again, that everything should be perfect because you have everything you need. But it seems that something is severely lacking. And so I feel a bit of sympathy because I get it. I understand why people want to go get pharmaceutical drugs, for instance, to sort of numb themselves to the reality that their jobs are sucking the life out of them. And the political system seems to not really serve common people's interests anymore. There seems to be a lot of different things that are happening simultaneously to make, in general, the population very anxious, very short-sighted, very depressed, and all of these dysfunctions and disorders you're mentioning are rising. And that seems to me to be a nation that is totally on the way out, a society that seems to be falling apart at the edges. And
well, it has fallen apart to a large extent. If you look at communities in the deindustrialized zones, those have been pretty much destroyed. If you look at the quote unquote homeless population on the streets of places like San Francisco and Seattle, where they tend to congeal, that's another thing. It's the problem is said to be homelessness. Well, no, the problem is is drug addiction, and then for drug addicts, the right kind of housing, which is free, is a tent on public or private land. It doesn't matter where, surrounded by garbage. And that if you're a drug addict and that's your full-time occupation, then that's pretty much okay. That's what one should expect. So it's like treating the problem as homelessness. Well, no, the problem is drug addiction and mental health issues. But that's not the root cause. The root cause is a country that forces people to become addicted to drugs and to develop mental illnesses in all of its various ways.
Right.
It's basically the structure of the entire society that's causing this to happen.
Right. Yeah, I see it. I mean, I have to, say I'm a part of this too. I've seen it in myself, but I see it all around me, and it's I think, especially when we talk about these broader trends, people aren't going to be paying attention to these things as much, because I think that the very nature of being addicted to something like drugs, as you're mentioning, but I think there's all kinds of addictions that people have. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of heroin or something like that, or pills. There's all kinds of ways that people can address this pain that I think people are experiencing right now. And it makes people very short-sighted in their lives and their worldview. And it seems also that the United States is more prone to figures like Donald Trump to come into power, because he is an idiot, as you have pointed out very well, but he understands well enough how to manipulate people. He understands how to.
Well, don't single him out. He's not the only idiot.
I know. Yeah.
And let's zoom out a little bit.
Yeah.
There's an addiction in the United States that's 100 times worse than heroin or crystal meth, and that's politics. That's national politics. People are addicted to paying attention to the goings-on either the Democratic side or the Republican side or among the independents. They're very polarized. They think that the other side is evil, whereas their side, has issues, but is somehow better. They're wrong. They seem to think that it matters who's president. They're wrong. Absolutely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter who's president. They seem to think that it matters whether they vote and how they vote. No, it doesn't matter whether they vote and how they vote. It doesn't make any difference at all. But people are keyed up. They think that this stuff is important. They lose friendships over disagreements over completely stupid politics, just completely stupid stuff. So that's just another kind of like it's an addiction. It's a delusion at the same time, and it's a horrendous waste of time.
Mm. Are there any other examples that we can look to? I always hear like this is like the Roman Empire when it collapsed, or this is like this or that. Is there any historical or even contemporary examples of what we're going through? I mean, again, speaking as someone here situated in the United States, are there any other examples that Americans can look to kind of understand what's happening? Has there been anything else like this in human history?
Well, I don't think that studying history is really going to help. This situation is very different from anything that went before. What will happen, how things will evolve in the United States will be different from any other scheme, because the United States is really based on a living arrangement, based on sprawl and the private automobile and highways and this sort of commoditized, privatized, corporatized realm, which utilizes economies of scale very aggressively to the point where it actually kind of like it's a parasite that destroys the host. Like Walmart will destroy all retail within a large area and then deplete the savings of the people in the area because everything is imported and none of that is recycled as wages, or very little of it is. And then the Walmart closes that location because it can no longer make money there. And then there's nothing. So that's the model of development that the United States is pursuing, is basically hollowing itself out, virtualizing the wealth, concentrating that wealth in terms of paper wealth in very few hands, and then poof, it disappears. The stock market crashes and it all just goes away, leaving nothing. But that's really the mode of development in the United States. And so I've said that many years ago. I think I dozen years ago is the first time I pointed that out. The very first article I wrote, I pointed out that what will happen to the United States is something that can be described as spontaneous existence failure. It'll just go poof. Now, right now, we have large parts of the country that go poof. New Orleans went poof. Various other whole cities and towns just disappear. Entire states will fall into destitution. I think Illinois is kind of like queuing up for that. And that'll just be the trend. There'll be less and less of it left. And the people will disappear too, because how many years can you just, live on the street shooting up drugs before you too go away? So there'll be a depopulation happening along the way. You can't really sustain a country where half the children are born into poverty for very long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just seems like a completely unsustainable model, and it doesn't seem like there's, like supposedly we're supposed to be inspired by certain politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's a few other people I'm thinking of, Bernie Sanders, so-called progressives, these types that are proposing, universal healthcare or something like universal healthcare, Medicare for all. I know Cortez has been proposing, and we'll see where this goes, but the Green New Deal, right? This sort of massive restructuring of the economy and the infrastructure. And it just seems like there's a lot of proposals that seem really unrealistic. But I feel like
Oh yeah, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a cute puppy, but her ideas are just phenomenally dumb, but funny. I enjoy paying attention to her because it's just it's comical. It's really, really comical.
Mm. Yeah, I see all these different proposals that are coming out to try to supposedly save us. And the more and more I look at these things, and I think when you talked about the whole mental health thing earlier, it definitely makes people less critical, right? It definitely makes people less critical of these types of things and more willing, I think. I mentioned Trump earlier and his ability to kind of manipulate groups of people. It seems like we're more primed for that kind of thing than ever before, where people are willing to bank on a politician or a group of individuals in positions of power to save us. And it doesn't seem like that's not only is that unlikely, but it's entirely a waste of time to believe in that. So it's really, what I appreciate about your writing, Dmitry, is that you are looking at the United States from a very different perspective than I get from almost anyone else. There's no one else that really writes the way you do about it. But it really, it's like I'm here in the United States, and a lot of people listening to this podcast are in the United States, and they feel things are changing very rapidly. But I think a lot of times people don't understand why. And they may have a bunch of different reasons, but to have kind of a more unified perspective is really hard to find because there's so many upsetting things that are happening all the time. It seems to distract us away from the bigger picture. And I think you provide that in your writing. I think you do a fantastic job. And you're also very funny, which is, I think, really helpful.
Well, thank you.
You're very funny, which is very, very helpful. Yeah. It really helps it go down a little easier, I think. I think everything, I don't know, we covered a lot. I think we touched on a lot of different topics. I really just wanted to get kind of an overview of various things that are unfolding right now and get kind of a layout of where we stand today. And I think you did that. So I know that if people want to find your work, I know that you have your blog, which is cluborlov.blogspot.com, but you release one article a week, one essay a week on that blog, but you also do another essay a week at your Patreon page, and you only need to donate, I think, $1 a month to gain access to those essays as well. And I've really appreciated.
That's right.
Yeah. Sorry.
There's a Patreon account that has a bunch of people, and I also have a Subscribe Star account, which is basically similar but smaller platform. A lot of people have issues with Patreon because it is one of those Silicon Valley type, San Francisco type companies that has its political agenda, just like Facebook, just like Google. And a lot of people don't really feel that private corporations should be in charge of reinterpreting the First Amendment and deciding who gets to practice free speech and who doesn't. So for those people, I have, as an option, added Subscribe Star, which has all the same content.
Subscribe
Patreon.
Star?
Yeah. So every time I publish something that's paywalled, there are two different links, one for Patreon, one for Subscribe Star. That seems to be working pretty well. Something like 15-20% of the people are migrating to Subscribe Star, which is fine. But it's just I don't have a I don't have a dog in this race. I do not believe that private corporations should be empowered to reinterpret the First Amendment as they see fit. I think that that's a bad thing, but then I'm not in a position to change the world in any drastic ways. All I'm doing is adding an option.
Okay. Yeah, I use Patreon too, and I know Patreon has been changing. They're always tweaking it and changing it and trying to. And I know a lot of creators, a lot of people making things that want to get paid for it and want to give people an option to donate to their projects. They're always looking for something that gives them, they want to feel secure, I guess. And Patreon doesn't always do that very well. So I'm going to look into that. So you said Subscribe Star. So I'll be sure to link people to your Patreon, your blog, and to your Subscribe Star profile as well. You are on social media a bit. You do share things on there, but the majority of your work seems to be through those platforms. So I'll be sure to let people know about that because I think your writing is really good, even if people don't agree. And I have to say, I don't always agree with every single thing you say, but you are able to shake up my views enough to let me it refreshes my understanding often. So it's very good to have you around, and I really appreciate you for doing what you do.
Well, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Last Born in the Wilderness. Have a wonderful week, and as a psychedelic bard Terence McKenna said, take it easy, dude, but take it.